Hello, everyone. Welcome to the World Press Freedom Day Alumni panel. My name is Miya. I'm a first-year student from South Africa. And we also have two other exciting student facilitators today. We have Hashim from Jordan and Smriti from Bangladesh. So to start off the panel, we're going to introduce you to our amazing panelists. And we're going to go in kind of an order of who we'll be partnering up with in our various breakout rooms, which we'll explain to you in a little bit. But I'm also going to ask the panelists, after you've been introduced, to maybe quickly respond to a little icebreaker question, which is, what is your personal favorite piece of journalism that you've worked on and why? And if your work is free, paste that in the chat so everyone can have a look at it. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first guest from London, and she's graduated from MUWCI.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really excited to be here. It's really awesome to be back at MUWCI in a way. And just, I mean, on kind of my favorite piece of journalism. So I worked a couple of years ago on a platform on challenging hate speech. And it's different from, I think, from the kind of, reporting journalism, because this is really a platform that was geared towards policymakers, towards journalists, towards young adults. And so I had to really design for each of those audiences. But basically, the reason I love this piece of work so much is because I just learned a huge amount from it. There was a lot of research I needed to do, getting to grips with hate speech from kind of a legal perspective, all the nuances. I had to look at the psychology of hate and think about what really constitutes hate speech, where it comes on, how best to address it. I think also it was a really great piece of work because it was really collaborative. I was lucky enough to be working with some really brilliant, legal minds, and also some really talented artists. So that was just awesome. And also the work's been translated into multiple languages. So it's had wide reach. It's kind of been translated into Arabic, into Russian, into Kyrgyz, and it's been used across a few different countries. And I'm really hopeful that that continues to happen. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rahat. I'll now pass over to Hashim to introduce Nicolas.
Hello. So my name is Hashim and I'm from Jordan. I'm very excited to be here today in such a wonderful session with the wonderful people all over the world. So today I will be with my buddy, Nicolas, joining us today from Tel Aviv, Palestine, graduated from UK in 2004. During his career, he has reported on Middle East, the Balkan, Puerto Rico, India, and Ethiopia, and he has also written fiction. He credits a spontaneous 2017 trip to Puerto Rico, where he followed some cryptocurrency millionaires, as a thing that he drove him back to journalism full time. He's currently in Palestine, Israel, corresponds for various European news outlets. So welcome, Nico.
Hi, how's it going? Sorry, it took me a while to find the mute button there. Thanks for the introduction, Hashem. So yeah, I think I'm supposed to say what my favorite piece of journalism is. And I think, to be honest, I think I will go with what Hashem mentioned in his beautiful introduction. In 2017, I literally, was I just had been out of journalism for a while. And I kind of went on the whim to Puerto Rico to follow some cryptocurrency billionaires who were moving there, trying to rebuild trying to build a utopia out of a territory that had been wiped out by two successive hurricanes a few months previously. It's a story that I managed to follow in and out for about 2 years. And I went there, I did a documentary for The Guardian, what came out of our first trip, with a friend of mine. And then I later on followed it up with a long form story for a French magazine called 21, which was amazing. They gave me a lot of space to write, it was like a 5,000-word story. And it was, I think basically out of all the journalism that I'm doing today, a lot of it is just, get in, get out, report the news, try to put as much of it, as much about the characters and about the people who live that story, but in the end, it is about, you know, reporting the news and then trying to understand what the consequences of that specific event is for, you know, people abroad, people within that territory. In that specific story, I was able to just follow a group of people that fundamentally were just individuals and try to understand them better and try to understand where they were at play in all kinds of different narratives that are taking place in Puerto Rico, including decolonization, including, you know, the rise of new financial systems, the, you know, kind of anarcho-capitalism and so on and so forth. And so it has to be my favorite piece of journalism so far, just because it gave me that much latitude to understand the situation that was fundamentally foreign to me, but also was so related to a lot of my own challenges. So yeah, I think I'll go with that. I feel like my head is full of other things right now because of the situation, as you can imagine, in the place where I am. But yeah, I'll go with that one.
Thank you, Nicolas. Here I pass to Smithy.
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Smriti from Bangladesh, as Neil already introduced me. Thank you so much, Neil. And my buddy for today is Samira Sadiq from Bangladesh. She's joining us today from New York, and she's a MUWCI alum who graduated from the class of 2008. She has reported on a range of issues, from the Rana Plaza factory collapse in 2013 in Dhaka, Bangladesh's first ever LGBTQ magazine, US electoral politics, and the pandemic's impact on South Asian Americans. Samira also writes and performs poetry with a focus on migration, hate speech, gender, and mental health. So welcome, Samira. And if you'd like to talk a little bit about yourself and also about the question that Neil stated.
Hi, everyone. It's so wonderful to be back here. I'm sure you can see that I'm beaming. And thanks, Midi, for the introduction. Yeah, I think pretty much what you said. I'm a journalist and a poet based here in New York, and I pretty much, both in my journalism and my poetry, write about the same things, which has to do with immigration, hate speech, gender violence, etc. And my most favorite piece of journalism that I enjoyed doing, it was difficult to choose, I'll admit, but the one that I decided on was my first semester at the J School here in New York. I was reporting, so we all had to pick a beat, and I was reporting on a Hasidic Jewish community in New York, in Brooklyn, and it's the largest Hasidic community in the country here in Brooklyn, and I was a clear outsider, you know, I stood out as such, but I embedded myself in the community over the course of one semester. And my main focus was reporting on young women from non-observant Jewish families who traveled across the country and some across the world to become a part of the community, which was really interesting to see how they navigated with that journey with their families who raised them as non-observant, right? And so I followed them over the whole semester, and the most wonderful part of it was how warmly they welcomed me, and you know, they took me to their prayers. They took me to Yom Kippur prayers. It was in the fall, so I got to celebrate the high holidays with them, and you know, just anything from eating at their hostel to going to Selikot prayers. It was a really wonderful experience, and yeah, I think for me, just having that level of trust from a community, from these young women who were sharing such a personal story was really, really wonderful to have. I can actually drop a link in the chat. It was published. It was published on. So I went to Columbia Journalism School, and it was published in one of our publications from the J School.
Thank you so much, Samira, and thank you for dropping the link to the next panelist as well. Feel free to drop a link for your work if you have one. We'd love to see it, I'm sure. Next, I'd like to pass on to Angad to introduce our next panelist.
Great. I am introducing Miya. Miya is currently in Sydney. She graduated from MUWCI in 2009. And in her current role as journalist and sub-editor for the Finnish news agency STT, She covers everything from global politics, domestic Finnish news, and sports. She's been writing professionally since her time at MUWCI and has also written about Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, and Australia, along with doing some radio and TV work in her early career. So that's Miya. And Miya, could you share with us what's your personal favorite piece of journalism that you worked on and why? And feel free to drop a link in the chat as well.
Thank you so much. And as the other panelists have said, it's lovely to be in MUWCI, sort of. Just like happy to see all the faces and like, yeah, nostalgia. My favorite piece, I think it was also very difficult to choose. And especially while working in a newsroom, you're just like, you're in a chaos of like different topics from day to day. But I did come into a conclusion that it's, for me, the most important part is when you actually connect with people. And I think, well, for my latest work, I think one of the most touching stories or touching moments I've had has been when Australia had the bushfires right before COVID. And we happened to find a Finnish man who had lost his whole home in New South Wales, Australia. And why it's important that he's Finnish, because Finnish news enjoy, well, not enjoy, but like there is this belief that if something happens to a Finn, people read it more. So if you find a Finnish person, which I think is, well, I don't fully agree with this idea, but anyway, it was really difficult to find him because I just saw him in an Australian piece of news. And I didn't find him anywhere. He was like older man. I didn't find him anywhere. And then I wrote to the Australian journalist who was kind enough to pass my number to his wife. And then he called me and was like, yeah, you can come, and was excited to meet like a fellow person from the same country. And he had forgotten how to speak Finnish and so on. And yeah, it was like, well, I've never seen such horrible like devastation either. Just like if you imagine like what can be burned, and then you end up into a forest and it's just everything is burned, and somehow it was also interesting because it turned out somehow it became clear that we also have really like different political views, which usually as a journalist you don't go and tell what you think in politics place. But he would, for example, say that he didn't really believe in climate change and things like that. And somehow there was still this like respect between us, that I listened to him and he listened to me and so on. And I was really happy to have enough resources to go down there and meet him and have the time to write the piece and think about it, which I usually don't have. But I guess I would choose this one, and it's in Finnish, but I trust in Google Translate in the sense that if you want to read it, you can sort of get the idea from Google Translate. But yeah, I can still share it.
Yes, please do. I, for one, promise to read the translation and recount this experience. Thank you so much for sharing. I think I'll move on to our last panelist, which I will introduce.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm introducing our last panelist for today, who is, let me just find her. Yeah, our last panelist for today, who's Paroma. She's joining us today from New York. She graduated from MUWCI in 2013. During her career, she has worked as a video producer and editor at BuzzFeed India, which I am so curious about. She has also worked with Homegrown and Slate magazine. Her work has mainly centered around politics, culture, gender, and identity. And currently she's pursuing a master's degree in data journalism at Columbia University. And we'd love to know what's been a personal favorite for you.
Oh, there you go. Thank you. I wasn't able to unmute. But thank you so much for having me and for that very flattering introduction. It's nice to be here. I can't imagine what MUWCI is like virtually. And yeah, I'm at Columbia Journalism School doing data stuff. So it's pretty technical, very new from what I've done for the last like 3 or 4 years. I enjoy it. But I think my favorite piece of journalism that I worked on was actually the one non-data story that I did last semester. I did a piece on Koli women in Mumbai. They're like Mumbai's indigenous fisherwomen. And I was writing about how their informal networks and their friendships and really the community that they formed helped them sort of survive the pandemic with each other, not relying on state support, not relying on any sort of relief because they didn't get any, and sort of how they adapted to it. And this was a story I reported on for like 4 or 5 months almost. So it was a long project. I was in the community all the time. More than 90% of it didn't actually make it to the story, but like just getting to know them, getting to know the community. I think similar to what Samira was saying, it was a really like immersive time. Like we really got to know the women super well. And I like how the story ended up. I'll post a link. But yeah, that's me.
Thank you for that, Paroma. I'm going to hand it back to Neo now, who has the first question for all our panelists.
Hi everyone, back again. So I think that it's really important that because this session is obviously on World Press Freedom, that we do set a little bit of context as to what World Press Freedom Day means and what it represents. So we know that like in MUWCI and in UWCs as a whole, oftentimes it tends to be very open in terms of freedom of criticism and freedom of expression, but this isn't necessarily always contextually the case in the countries that we're from. So we really wanted to extend this to our panelists here and kind of ask you, what is Press Freedom Day to you? What does it represent? And how have you interacted with it in your different contexts? I'd like to ask Rahat to start if she'd be willing, and then just kind of open from there.
Sure. So I was thinking about this question actually quite a lot when over the last couple of days, and I think I wrote something down. I'd like to read it out to you guys if that's okay. And so really this is it. So as an individual and a member of society, it means I have somewhere reliable to go for credible information, to stay informed, to understand how my society performs. As a citizen, it means locally or nationally, if my government is failing to deliver on their promises, there is a platform to highlight this to others so that together we can engage with the issues and take action. As a media professional, it means that my colleagues, those who are journalists, activists, or human rights defenders, are safe and secure and can do their jobs without being afraid of being harassed or arrested or killed. As a woman, as a Muslim, most of all as a human being, it means that when any person or any community is attacked or targeted, there is a mechanism in place that can draw attention to them and hopefully help for justice. And as someone who has family and friends and colleagues of multiple countries, a robust media is how I stay abreast of global developments, so that even when the news is heart-wrenching or scary or relentless, it allows me to bear witness, stand in solidarity, and to support where I can. Because really, if we don't have a free press, no one would know. And if no one knows, no one cares. So I think there's that perspective. And then there's a perspective I have on this, which is from a human rights approach, which is that really press freedom is a corollary of the public's right of access to knowledge, which is our right to know, right? Which is really the other side of freedom to speak. And I think this is really important and it matters because the way I understand this, there's two roles that the media has. So one is to provide information to the public, right? Which is to help to build understanding and consensus. And that kind of contributes to the growth of public knowledge. And the second is really to function as a watchdog, which is to scrutinize the actions of government and whoever's in power, right? So, so that really provides a sort of check and balance in a democracy. And if either of those things are compromised, then we are all collectively prevented from solving any of our problems. And if you think about it in the context of right now, I mean, I'm just thinking about COVID, as the most obvious current example. We can see this. We can see this across Brazil, across, US, Iran, Mexico, India. Governments have refused to acknowledge the extent of the problem. And, that's the consequences of that are really severe. So, I mean, I can, just in the context of India, at the start of the pandemic, like we know that Modi never holds press meetings with any editors or any journalists anywhere. It's very rare. And he had called the editors of all of the mainstream Indian media and told them to sort of report positive stories only. And we know that there's been a fraction of cases and deaths reported. The real numbers of, about deaths, infections, lack of equipment, all of this has been covered up or not really made available through the media. And to a large extent, it's because of that poor information. That, the public also has thought that the threat had passed. And I mean, we can kind of see the consequences of that as we're speaking right now. So that's, that's kind of what it means, I think, for me.
I can go next. I think to me, press freedom means, well, hopefully that someday we won't have to have a separate day for it. Start off. And to me, press freedom isn't just about my ability as a journalist to be telling the story, but also for my readers to be able to access those stories. In Bangladesh, we often see, and I'm sure in other countries, when foreign news, does an expose on something to do with the country, we have those sites temporarily blocked so that people in the country are not able to access those stories. And so in that moment, it matters very little that someone was able to tell the story if those who matter the most are not able to read it, right? And another thing is that, like, press freedom to me is that we're allowed to tell the stories when it's most needed. I think the pandemic was a very big reminder that it's often in times of crisis that the media is under highest scrutiny and highest restriction, whether it's the pandemic or if you take elections or any kind of crisis. And that's just unfortunate, because it's in these times, kind of echoing what Rahat said, it's in these times that we are the ones who are tasked to keep the public informed, and press freedom means that process not being hindered, right? It means that we live in a system where if I write an article, my editor doesn't have to worry 3 times about whether he can have my back or not, whether we can use certain words in a publication or not, because that might instigate some kind of a reaction. Yeah, that's it for my end.
Sorry, everyone, I dropped out for a few seconds because of power cuts. Very classic MUWCI. But would anyone else like to share?
I can go as well. I mean, to be honest, what they said, right? I mean, a lot of, I mean, I'm not going to repeat everything that Rahat and Samira said. I think that's the most amazing points you guys have made, all the points that I would have wanted to make. I'm just going to add a small thing, I guess, which is about from my own experience as well. Obviously, the reason I think why we have one specific day to talk about this is specifically to talk about the issues. Often the media gets a lot of flack for, and rightfully so. The media also needs to be watched, and it's totally normal. But there's a lot of issues that need to be. I think it's also, what is it to be a journalist? How can we attract more people to be journalists? How can we make the media sector more sustainable? That safer. I think for a lot of journalists, especially in the global south. I think all of those things, that's kind of the reason why we have those conversations on that specific day, so, to be able to come up with solutions all together. So I think that's why right now we're here talking about this, right? Because it affects us every day. It affects us in every aspect of our lives, but it also, there's some very specific issues that are related specifically to that field that is not repeated anywhere else. So I think that, to me, that's important. And, I'm saying that also just to bring it back to my own history as somebody who worked for 5 years in a press freedom organization, where I was giving personal support to individual freelance journalists in crisis in sub-Saharan Africa mostly. And that's and we're not talking specifically about places like Europe or the States, but obviously as Samira said, and as I had also mentioned in Bangladesh, in India, but also in places where the media is just poor. It's not necessarily the fact that the media is watched or unsafe, but it's also just poor. It just doesn't have, where they rely on information coming from some British guy coming from the BBC in order to be able to tell them what's going on next door. And that's just something that cannot be allowed to continue. That's me.
I'd like to also just quickly add, I think you guys have summed it up pretty well, is the legal aspect of it. I think it's important to not press freedom for me means that you can have a way to report as a journalist without getting caught up in the bureaucracy of getting permits and stuff. I think a lot of times that I've been trying to write, people will kind of be like, oh, you're not allowed to do this, despite having a press pass and stuff. And just the concept of saying, yes, it's completely normal for the press, for journalists to come report on a thing that's happening that may not even be super confidential or something. Just like an environment that where journalists can thrive legally, if that makes sense.
I could also add, there isn't much to add because you guys have really summed it up quite well. But I would like to add also that I think with the freedom of press, there's also responsibility that comes with it. So reliability, trustworthiness, that are values and in the core ethics of journalism. But those are, I think, journalists also sometimes might get caught up in their perspectives or their views or whatever. So it's responsibility is something that we need to be remind ourselves of every day in the newsroom or whatever we're writing.
Thank you all so much for sharing. We are going to move into breakout rooms now, but before we wanted to do that, we'd like our panelists to briefly explain what they'll be focusing on in their breakout rooms, because I know you all have different themes that you'd like to discuss. These are on the slides as well. But if you just like to briefly outline the main idea. Again, we can start with Rahad, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm going to basically just talk to you guys about, so because I work with a human rights organization, and we have offices in different parts of the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges we're seeing broadly, and then some solutions that we're working on, and some challenges to those solutions as well.
Nicolas, would you like to go next? Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So I've got the topic I'm going to talk about, or we're going to have a conversation about, I guess, is information as a public good. It's actually the World Press Freedom Day theme this year for its 30th anniversary, and then mostly it revolves around the kind of things that I was talking about a little bit before, about the economic viability of the media especially in the digital age, but also in a fragile environment. And I think a lot of it is about, at the end of the day, is about how we consume information today, and how does that affect the way that information can be produced. And also, I guess, what it means. What does information mean? What is the difference between information and just something that is produced by a press organization rather than something that you just grab off Facebook or of your neighbor in your local cafe? That's me. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's talk to Samira.
I'll be talking about threats to freedom of speech in Bangladesh, for not just for journalists, but also for citizens, and how it kind of affects how much we're able to share and criticize what's going on in the country, and hopefully a bit about how my journalism informs my poetry as well.
Thank you, Samira. And Miya, would you like to?
Yeah, we're going to talk about diversity in journalism, especially diversity in the newsroom, like within the newsmakers and topics that we cover, and how that's linked to, well, trustworthiness. And where I work, we see also that the covering parts, different parts of society, it's also creates more trust in within the public. And when the news are diverse, when covered diversely, I believe, and we believe, that it also keeps people from disinformation. So yeah, we were talking about diversity.
Thank you, Miya. And last but definitely not least, Paroma, would you like to introduce your breakout room topic?
Sure. So I'm going to be talking about how, as journalists, we adapt to a social media environment that is constantly flooded with information, and sort of how you adapt to that, like how do you convert complex stories into 15-second TikToks, and how do you have that same impact? And then also, as a consumer of the news and of journalism, how do you sort of sift through this and find the things that are accurate and honest and ethical?
All right.
So, hello. Hi, everyone.
Hey.
So, hi again. I'm Hashim Hattab, and I'm from Jordan. And as you can see, our wonderful panelist and speaker, Nicolas. So, before we jump into the theme, there are two questions that have come from the students on the campus. So, the first question, Nicolas, is how do you, as a professional, go about navigating the line between your employer being a company that competes with other media outlets and thus needs to create an eye-catching headline, and the ethics of breaking sensitive stories?
I think, to be honest, it's an interesting question, specifically because I'm right now working as a freelancer, so I kind of have both. I can see both aspects of the kind of like the broad divide in the world of journalism, which is that, on one side you can be working for a company, on one side you can be working for yourself. In both cases, you kind of need to be, the headline needs to be sexy. You need to be able to look at something that will eventually sell, and these days it will eventually sell clicks. It used to be that in print journalism, I'm a writer, and it used to be that in print journalism we had more leeway. You know what I mean? In terms of like the editorial content, people would just there would be like more of a lead time in terms of finding out what was actually appreciated by your audience. Today, it's obviously less true. You're sanctioned immediately if something isn't, if something is not attracting attention, you're sanctioned immediately because of social media, because of the way that, we monitor online traffic and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, that's kind of the point about being a professional journalist. So being a professional journalist, and the way that training should be, especially in terms of ethics training, should be about the fact that you have a responsibility to the characters of your story. And the characters of your story are not only the people that are inhabiting your story, the people that you bring to the attention of the rest of the world, but also the people that are affected by it. I think you have to navigate that with your own conscience, and that conscience needs to be shaped by your experiences, needs to be shaped by the training that you receive, needs to be shaped by your peers and the ambience that is fostered within that. Which is why, it kind of brings me to the fact that in the end, we need to have more sustainability in journalism. And being a freelancer, I know how difficult that is, right? I can't sell a story if an editor thinks that it's not good enough. Often that means that I need to put a lot of my own resources into finding the story before I can pitch it. And that means that those resources go to waste. We need to come up with systems that allow journalists to work more freely in that economic sense as well, basically, outside of the pressures of the government and so on and so forth.
We have a raised hand from Hamdia. Sorry if I spelled your name correctly.
Oh yeah, she's asking how she can go to. I'm pretty sure she might be related to Rahat, and she's asking how she can go to Rahat's group.
So I think you need to leave breakout room, and Ninad will be in the home. Or I think this is.
We might have.
Yeah. So
I might have screwed that up by not joining the breakout room.
No, it's okay. So there's the 3 dots with the saying more. Then you press join breakout room and choose the one that you want. I hope I answered the question. Any responses from or any questions about what was the first question? Okay, so moving on to the second question. Nicolas, to what extent do governments affect the anatomy of media outlets?
I mean, basically, a lot of the time, especially working here in Israel, Palestine, the government basically controls everything that you do. In Israel, there's a military censor that basically, allows your story to go on and off. Especially, it's fundamentally related only to security issues. But then, in actual fact, especially when you work for the Israeli press, a lot of issues are directly linked to security. So that can have a wide-ranging effect on your work. I used to work for an Israeli paper. I now don't, but I'm still kind of under those restrictions, even as a freelance foreign journalist. I had to sign a contract in order to get my press card, and that contract says that I agree to abide by the rules of the censor. Same thing goes into the Palestinian territories. To a lesser extent, obviously, they have less control over what they can and cannot do just simply, and they don't generally control the foreign press, but they definitely also, have a tight leash on the digital kind of voice of Palestinian citizens, including journalists. Including by putting them in jail, including by doing all kinds of terrible things. It's fundamentally the government allows that space. It's a little bit like property, right? The government allows, if you don't have a government, you don't have property rights. If you don't, this is like the capitalist, ABC. If you don't have property rights, you can't sell goods, and so therefore you can't have capitalism. It kind of works the same way with media in terms of the fact that it has to exist under some kind of an umbrella of some sort. Like the government also needs to provide you with security. You need to be able to have, as a journalist, you should be able to be allowed in spaces that the regular population might not have access to. And that's fundamentally because the government acts as the fifth estate, acts as the watchdog. The media acts as a watchdog, and I'm not sure I said government there. So basically the government is an all-important player. It needs to be done in partnership in some way or another, some kind of like a hands-off partnership between the government and the media. In order to be able to tell the story, the government should be able to have the kind of confidence to be able to say, I want to be watched and I want to be, that's what should happen in a democracy anyway. And similarly, the media should have the strength and the economic strength, again, to go back to the subject that we're talking about here, to be able to say, okay, we will accept some kind of checks and balances from the government as well. Guys, I just want to say, given the fact that we're so few, we can just you guys can just unmute and also show your faces like beautiful Sam did over here. I know Sam from a long time ago. Feel free anyway.
I think
that's it. Yeah.
So, as Nicolas said, it can be a more informal session because we have less number of people, so it will be direct responses or like direct questions. If anyone has any question to ask.
100%. I mean, we can lead it off 100% for sure, but feel free to ask however you see fit. And also regarding your own special interests, obviously, I don't claim to be an expert at everything, but I do have quite a long experience in this now, so I'm happy to answer any questions whatsoever.
Nico.
Hey, dude.
Nico, maybe people don't know you, but how has your experience working with the Rory Peck Trust, supporting independent journalists, influenced you now as an independent journalist yourself?
So I used to work for an organization based in London that was supporting freelance news gatherers. It's called so it's a little bit of a broader definition than journalists. It includes bloggers in some way, some capacity. So freelance news gatherers in crisis. it, you know, a lot of the work that I did, and it was mostly based around Sub-Saharan Africa, as I said before, a lot of work that I did applied to a lot of people that worked in the news industry in that time in Sub-Saharan Africa, mostly because, you know, the kind of media environment over there is so fragile, and they have, you know, so little resources that a lot of journalists have to be employed as freelancers, you know, be able to, for the news outlets to survive, and often there's a lot of exploitation that comes with it. A lot of the work was about safety, and so it's a little bit different from the topic of what we're going to talk about here, but it's not unrelated in the sense that basically, if we go from the position that information, and especially information that is gathered by press professionals, by media professionals, is something that everybody needs, everybody uses, and as Rahad said very beautifully in her introduction, you know, it's a major part of what allows us to have a voice in this world, in the world in which we live, and especially, you know, for us all here as you know, more global citizens or whatever, to be informed of things that might be happening very far, and maybe happening to a community, to our own community, to communities that we're interested in, and so on and so forth. Safety is a major aspect of that for journalists. You know, we're talking about the fact that, you know, journalists in places, especially in places like Mexico, in places like Somalia, get killed just for doing their work. It also happens, you know, in every country closer to home. If it's not government, it's organized crime. You know, so I think personally, obviously in my reporting, this is something that's very, you know, it's obviously, it comes in my mind, you know, like daily, you know, if I'm stuck in a demonstration with, you know, with far right, you know, extremist settlers, Israelis, you know, in Jerusalem, that happened a couple of weeks ago. You know, obviously there is a lot to think about in that specific moment, and sometimes you know, you need to be able to navigate which questions can I ask, which questions should I not ask at this point, which questions am I ready to, you know, to actually get into danger for. And basically, again, like in that specific instance, your responsibility is not to yourself. Your responsibility is obviously to keeping your own safety, but your responsibility is also to, you know, to the story that you want to tell. You can decide to go in some place and be in a dangerous position and not ask the questions, right? And then what you come out with is basically only your bias, only your own, you know, your own kind of vision of what's going on in that specific instance. You know what I mean? Whereas, like, maybe the story isn't that. Maybe the story is that in this specific instance, for example, in the demonstration in Jerusalem, obviously people shout death to Arabs, you know, burn their villages and stuff like that. You know, it's kind of generally, you don't want to be associated with these people. You don't want to go and sit down and have a conversation. But maybe the story is more about the fact that a lot of them are disaffected youth, you know, from a background that was previously extremely observant, and so therefore you have to be able to understand what are the dynamics at play. If you're not willing to put your safety at risk up to a certain extent, or to challenge yourself and potentially sometimes to your physical safety, then you won't be able to get the story as it should be told. So some of those things, I think in the end, it's about training, and I think again, like, that comes to the idea of information as a public good, which is that a lot of investment has to go into training media professionals. That investment is something that needs to go from, you know, I think from the very beginning, from the first moment at school, or not at school, but anywhere where you're confronted with the news media, you should be able to, you should learn that the news media needs to be consumed in a certain way, needs to be consumed responsibly. We need to become better consumers of news up to a certain extent in order for the media to become stronger and press freedom to become stronger as well. And it needs to go all the way to, you know, training journalists in the ethics of journalism, training journalists in their own safety and so on and so forth. And for that, unfortunately, there needs to be money. And in a world in which we're not willing to pay for news, we need to find better ways, of funding that, basically, better ways of investing into how the news is being produced fundamentally. And, you know, I think that's one of the major discussions now is to, you know, and especially in this World Press Freedom Day, topic, is how we can manage to bring out some of the revenue that has been pumped out of the news industry. So, you know, fundamentally, that it used to be that we would sell newspapers and that would basically pay the journalists, and then we would sell advertisements and that would pay the journalists. Now those sources of revenues have gone away, and so we find ourselves in this really tricky situation when a lot of important journalism, investigative journalism especially, is paid for by private capital. So sometimes, you know, it's something that you don't have, you know, you might agree agree with. It might be a foundation that that is run by somebody that you support. But also a lot of the time that journalism might be produced by news networks that that you disagree with, or that are backed by private capital with ties to the specific industry that they're reporting on, speaking especially about oil and gas and this kind of things. And so that basically we need to find other better ways of funding the media. There's ideas out there, but for the moment there's no political will to put them in place. And there's also, I think, in a way, the conversation needs to be started at a global level amongst newsreaders, in terms of getting them to pay for journalism up to a certain extent, either through their own subscriptions to news outlets that they rate, or through their own subscription to their internet subscription, this kind of thing. There's a bunch of funding models out there that are tangentially related to this. That's it. I mean, before going too deep into something else, guys, let me know if you have tell me if you have any questions. Feel free at any point of time, or Hashem, if you want to lead it somewhere else, feel free to tell me.
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I had a personal question on what you said, specifically about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So as a Jordanian, and my roots are from Palestine, and as you are a journalist working there in such a very complicated, let's say, environment.
Change that. That is just how it is. Hey, Hashem.
Sorry to be.
But
yeah.
So I just Wanda asked a question, so I'm just answering her. I think that the main thing. I mean, let's say this place, for example, right? Israel, Palestine, and just to take an example that's very simple. It's one of the most difficult, up to a certain extent, it's one of the most difficult news environments to report from. Not so much very large, not so much because there's so many people, it's a small place with a restricted population, but mostly because here are everything. Do you know what I mean? So they're constantly conflicting one against another. You have to try to be sensitive to everybody. You have to try to mention, but overall, kind of own worth or value, but that's what will eventually affect the way that I see the conflict as a whole, the territory in which it takes place, and does that territory include also millions of, for example, to take the example of Israel Palestine, does that territory also include millions of Palestinians who now live outside of the Holy Land, who have also immigrated from the Holy Land, like 100 years ago and before the creation of the State of Israel? Do these people have a voice? Is it also their story? All kinds of things like that will color the way that I think about the conflict. And so therefore, because it colors the way that I think about the conflict, I think it's a better pedagogical tool for me, for example, to use a certain reading of the way that I see Israel-Palestine in my reporting. And so it will infuse my reporting, do you know what I mean? Here, for example, another thing that would be an important aspect of it, in some news outlets, they choose to talk about Arab Israelis to define, the Arab citizens of Israel. I choose to use Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is a completely, it's a word more or whatever, but in the end, it completely redefines the identity of the people that are inhabiting in this territory. I don't think it's a problem. I don't think it's an issue. I think it's part of the media environment, and it's why we have to have press freedom in order to have many different news outlets, and not just one. I think it's you can, at the end of the day, you read the news according to the kind of outlets that you like better. You don't like them better because they're better at doing their job necessarily. Often they're just the same, but you like them better because you like their reading of the information better, the analysis better. So I think even in some instances, people might be watching Fox News, and potentially Fox News has some value to bring to the table. But you know, more often than not, they would read the New York Times, or they would read their local paper, or they would read the Sun in England or whatever, because they have that specific same outlook on life. Yeah, I think, does that make sense? Cool. Hashem, what was your question?
Oh yeah. So somehow it's a little bit connected to what you said about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So the question was, I was curious about the way, like, are you specialized in, for example, reporting to the Palestinian TV channels, the Israeli TV channels, or European TV channels, and how do you somehow, let's say, make sure to, like, because from what I saw on social media and what happens on the social media, somehow the news get a little bit based into a certain extent, depending on which political sides the person is with, and like that. So what do you do to make sure that your news and the piece of writing you did is 100% sure, like, it's fair and not a little bit based, depending on the readers or depending on the political side you are in?
Sorry, repeat the last thing you said, because it was kind of breaking up.
So the last thing is that what do you do to make sure that the piece of writing you said or the work you did is 100%, let's say, fair, like in the fair, and it's not based to a certain, let's say, side or a certain political party or a certain belief, you know?
I think that's a good point. I think it's like the most it's a crucial point. Sometimes basically I think you don't know who's like to who the story is happening. I read this quote the other day, which I think is kind of sums it up for me, is that, like, fundamentally the responsibility of the journalist is almost, right? Okay, almost, but it's almost to take the voice of the person that doesn't speak in the room, you know? There is that thing about, and it's not necessarily for everybody, but at least for me, I think that speaks to me. There is, you know, I think a lot of powers, a lot of people that have power, including government, including large corporations, including this, you know, large also ideological groups, have their own ways of disseminating information. Often the people, the voiceless, the people who don't have a voice, the regular people to which the story is happening, don't have a way to disseminate that information. Sometimes they're not necessarily the voiceless and not necessarily the powerless. You know, sometimes the voiceless is the silent majority. Sometimes the voiceless is, you know, kind of just the people that don't care, but to whom it's happening somehow and they just didn't realize it or whatever. So it can also be your reader. The voices can also be your reader. I think in this kind of instances, again, you kind of rely on your analysis. You know, you kind of rely on finding out. On it, you kind of have to decide who to go and speak to. You know, you kind of have you basically have to write the story first and then find the voices that you want to put in it. And that's a kind of a big secret of journalism. That's not a big secret, but it's kind of at the heart of it all, is that fundamentally the journalist writes the story. And, you know, there is obviously a fair amount of reporting involved in that, but often has to go back and try to get the voice that will fit in that exactly that right spot, that would be able to illustrate what he's saying or what they're saying about a specific story. So again, you know, we're relying on the same kind of thing. From the ethics of journalism, we're relying on the idea that some things need to be achieved. You know, like some things need to be, like, people need to be educated in order to be able to achieve the aims of what the press is trying to achieve for society as a whole. You know, I think it kind of brings me to what you're saying, kind of brings me to kind of like the second point about this whole information as a public good thing, which is outside of the, you know, economic sustainability of the field, which is also transparency and the idea that, you know, we can that media companies, internet companies together are the biggest producers of media and biggest producers of information, have to satisfy to some rules of transparency, and who watches them, and, you know, kind of who watches the watchman and this kind of thing. You know, I think that the point about this is that we all watching each other, and, you know, that's actually my wife, by the way, who's also from MUWCI. So we're all watching each other, and this is kind of what the media is supposed to be doing. And so, which is why we need to have stringent codes, of like, we need to ask the best of ourselves, you know what I mean? Which is why, I think, again, news outlets need to be called out, in Israel specifically, there's a news outlet here, for example, called Israel Hayom, which is a major news outlet. It's the biggest news outlet in Israel. That news outlet is 100% funded at a loss by a casino mogul who since passed away, but now is run by his wife, in Las Vegas, called Sheldon Adelson. This needs to be called out. This is not, you can't rely on the people to do exactly what I'm saying, to do due diligence, to go there and get this and talk to the, to the people that don't have a voice, to have that kind of, you can't rely on these people to do that, because they will fundamentally, most likely, have an agenda, or at least they prove to have an agenda politically. So, I think it's part of the responsibility of the journalist, and also of an educated, news consumer, to be able to call out news outlets on their own kind of failures. Look, everybody's coming back. That's it. I hope I answered your question, man.
Thank you, Nicolas. I think
so this breakout room has become so much more popular.
And that was my story, and you'll know that can also tell a very different story in the moment of a breaking news, in a moment of something really horrible that's happened to someone. There is no right quote. Everyone's going to say, if I had just been through an accident that you're reporting on, I'm going to say this is the worst thing that happened to me, right? So in terms of an interview and a quote, it really doesn't add a lot to the story. But I think you as a journalist can take a step back and really see what observations you can offer that can actually make your reader really understand something beyond like this person saying this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me.
Thank you so much, Samira. That was genuinely a very insightful answer to the question. And I think now we can move on to the main topic of this session, which is threats to freedom of speech in countries like Bangladesh. And I'm sure that you, of all people, are very familiar with the Digital Security Act in Bangladesh and the consequences that has had on freedom of press. So the question we have for you is that, how do you go about reporting in a country where freedom of press is so heavily restricted, like in Bangladesh?
I think for me, and this is, I don't think specifically about Bangladesh, but overall in countries with the issue, just too many of us, right? And I realized this recently when I was reporting on the farmers' protest in India, and kind of just reporting on it and just facing the vitriol of really vicious comments from people, from those who were anti-protest in India, right? And it can get very misogynistic, it can get very nationalistic, it can get very bad. But that being said, I think that was an important moment for me to realize that journalists in India were facing it even more, right? Like in many folds. But I think we can take an opportunity to be allies, to be journalist allies, to sort of, report on something in another country with the same depth, where those journalists might not be able to report directly, right? And this is not, I'm not talking about helicopter journalism where you just like go there for 2 days and you report on the issue, right? But really sort of working with journalists and working sort of in a collaborative or cooperative way to make sure that it's being told with the right nuances and is being told within the right context. And I think this is especially important for neighboring countries or countries who are in the same region, right? Where someone in Bangladesh can understand the politics of India and Pakistan and Nepal the same way as journalists from those countries can understand each other's politics. So it's not like I'm an American journalist who's just like going to this random South Asian country and like reporting on it without really understanding how the past few generations have shaped who we are today. You cannot report on South Asia no matter what the issue is, without taking into account how 1947 and eventually 1971 has trickled into our politics. And for us, politics is one of the biggest still one of the biggest things, because our politics aren't just like, it's so intricately interlinked with these other, especially India and Pakistan, just because we were one, right? And there was so much violence in as we each got liberated. So I think some kind of allyship where you work with journalists in a different country. It's kind of like, if you're not able to tell your story, I will, right? I will hold you through that, which sounds very like philosophical, but the point is just essentially being there and being able to report it with your knowledge, in the event that someone on the ground is not able to do so.
Thank you so much. I think that question relates to something else that I wanted to ask you, which is that, what do you think, like as journalists, you have a certain as you said, having journalists from other places help out, there's a sort of network of support where journalists can look out for each other. But as a common citizen of a country where press freedom is so heavily restricted, what can you do to protect your own freedom to say? For example, in Bangladesh, I know a lot of times I've been discouraged from reposting certain social media posts about protests or certain things going on because of the Digital Security Act, which I think you could explain the Digital Security Act a little bit as well for anybody who doesn't know what it is. But what can you do as a common citizen to protect your right to the freedom of speech?
Sorry, I was on mute. You'd think after being on Zoom for a whole year, you wouldn't make that mistake, but we're all still here. I think once again, this is more on a local level. Okay, I'll just start with the Digital Security Act, which was passed in 2018, and it was kind of, so again, this very much goes back to our history of independence and kind of communal violence in the country. It was inspired by a lot of communal violence which had been taking place kind of this past decade, namely, for example, in 2012, there was a whole series of Buddhist temples that had been burned down because there was a rumor, and again, this is a rumor, that a Buddhist Bangladeshi had posted something on Facebook ridiculing the prophet, right? And that wasn't the first one. There, over the years, I think there was one in 2016 against the Hindu community. And in these situations, it's inevitably the minority communities that get affected. And if you really think about it, if you are a religious minority in any country, it's very unlikely that you're going to be making fun of the majority religions like figure. Like that doesn't, especially in definitely in Bangladesh, because people know kind of the cost of that. Regardless, so that is, a few such incidents of that kind of is what kind of led to the Digital Security Act, because it was started as a way to censor such posts, right? That could incite such.
Guys, was that Samira's net?
That.
Hello.
Sorry.
Hi, Samira. Sorry, you just cut out for the past, I think, 30 seconds-ish.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Did you? Sorry.
I don't know if that was for everyone or if it was my net, but
it was most likely for everyone because it probably is my Wi-Fi. But I was
just repeat a little bit.
Sure. I was just saying, did you heard the part about how it was shaped, or like
I think
how it came about?
I think the part that I ended on was just you saying that the Digital Security Act was started to restrict those sort of posts.
Right. Kind of following all that, and then it soon spiraled into this. It soon spiraled into this thing that actually polices any kind of criticism, whether it's against a religious figure or against the state, or, you know, critiquing, making like jokes of cartoonists are very much under threat in Bangladesh, because obviously, you know, there are a lot of political cartoonists. So it's, you know, it's very easily the allegation of a propaganda is slammed on, right? Very easily that this is hindering our democracy. These kind of accusations very easily fall on anyone who remotely like says anything. In fact, we've actually had children being arrested for this, right? And I think 2020 or 2019, I believe, there was a 15-year-old boy who was arrested. Just last year, there was an 18-year-old and a 17-year-old who were also arrested for, you know, criticizing, I believe it was the government's response to the pandemic. So I think that, and if you're arresting children, that is a sign of how deep this goes, right? Sorry, that being said, what was your question? Because I got too hung up on the Digital Security Act description.
No, I think the context was really important as well. But the question was, what do you think the common citizen, say in Bangladesh or any other country where press is restricted, can do to protect their freedom of speech and to be able to still continue to speak up for issues that they believe in despite the restrictions?
Right. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's unfortunate that they have to make that choice. But I think something that can help is for those who are citizens but not in the city or not in the country to use their privilege to be able to speak up and share about it, right? Frankly speaking, those on the ground don't really have that much of a security, right? No matter what you do, there are really expensive surveillance, as was reported in the Al Jazeera documentary, that has gone into monitoring a lot of these voices. And it's important to remember that I think, and class privilege is a really big thing. Not everyone has the kind of security and safety to, you know, commute on private transport, to live in a building with a lot of security, to live in an area with a lot of security, right? There are a lot of the attacks and arrests that happen in certain parts of the country and city where very few people have digital, I wouldn't say digital access, but few people have the privilege of a network, of a strong network. So I think honestly in those terms, there really isn't a lot that those on the ground can do unless there's a change in the policies and the change. Sorry,
yeah,
did I
you
get
cut out for a little bit, like
sorry.
after change in policies.
Yeah, that's actually what I said. After that, I was just like, did it get stuck? So yeah, I think, and the other thing is going back to the point of being allies. I mean, not even as allies, I think for as long as people continue to speak up, I'm always in awe of those who are still speaking up. I think I look at it as kind of holding on to breadcrumbs, right? Like, if as long as there's one person, there's always going to be someone else who's doing it, right? And hopefully we as journalists can continue to do it so that people on the ground, people in their homes in Bangladesh, know that someone at least mentally has their back, right? And I think we saw this in 2018 when photojournalist Shahidul Alam was arrested following yeah, I know. I also get excited, but arrested following the student protests, right? And it was the biggest high school student protest that we've seen. And, you know, the way the international community rallied for him, encouraged people on the ground to rally for him, right? And that's because we knew that we all had each other's back. But I don't think it would be possible if everyone had just shut up, right? And not said anything and kind of just like gotten scared. And I think the other thing to remember is a lot of people think those speaking up aren't scared. We're always scared. Like, it's not, you know, that fear exists while folks are on the streets, while folks are online saying things. So I think a lot of people can get, sometimes they're like, oh, I'm not that brave, or like, I'm not that fearless to be writing it. But I think it's important for those people to know that every one of us lives in fear, but there's power in going ahead with it anyway.
Thank you so much, Samira. Now, we don't have much time left, so I'll quickly move on to the audience Q&A part of this session. So after listening to all of that, if there's any questions you guys have for Samira, anything you want to put, you can put it in the chat, or you can just speak up popcorn style. We can have a conversation. And it would be really nice if we could have videos on for this part so we can all see each other as we're interacting.
Thank you for being here, Samira. So I have like a question that's not fully connected to what you were speaking about, but I'm curious to know how continuity in stories work, because it seems like you've worked in a lot of different places and that involves a lot of traveling. And I'm just wondering about like maybe, if I'm not for lack of better words, sustainability in like journalism, and also about like continuity in these stories. So how is your experience with like reporting in different places? And do you think that journalists who report in one particular place might have some sort of like a different experience from yours?
Thanks for that question. Just quickly, when you say one type of place, do you mean like a specific city or just overall?
Any geographical region.
Okay. All right. So I think, can I just say that whenever I have to change my name out of fear on Facebook, I change it to Miya. So it's wonderful to see you here. But sorry, I just got distracted by that. I think in terms of sustainability, that's a really important question. And I think we're realizing that more and more. And for anyone who's considering it, I would say there is a lot of money out there for funding. So newsrooms don't have money, and that's real, and that's important to acknowledge. But how I go about it is applying for grants, applying for fellowships and scholarships, and that's not just US centric. That's also that can happen in whichever country you're in to apply for international grants. I think there is a restriction, and I don't know where you're from, but for me as a Bangladeshi, in terms of my passport, right, it doesn't take me anywhere. Like a US citizen can go to many different places in the world and just like report. And I know that that's something that really restricts me and restricts my reporting within the US, because I don't have, for example, I don't have a car, right? I can't go down to the border to report on what's happening at the US-Mexico border as much as I want to. So I have to figure out a way to get a grant. And in that case, like even getting a grant is difficult, like it's not difficult. Even if I get a grant, like how am I going to navigate without a car? So there are these like different things that can affect you in different countries. Whereas I think if you were in a place like India or Bangladesh, it's not that difficult to actually get on public transport and travel to a rural area. So I think accessibility makes a difference in different parts of the world, and you kind of just have to figure out what your strengths are, what you're able to do in that particular country. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. Yeah.
The breakout room is about to close, but before it does, I really wanted to ask you a question, and maybe you could just quickly say it, but like, we know you're a poet as well. So how does your poetry and your journalism inform each other?
I think my poetry is usually what completes my journalism story. It's where I get to put everything that my journalistic piece was either edited out or like names that were put out. So I'm going to quickly just say that's where it all goes to.
And so those that would have, we'll post this later. So for those who couldn't make it, they can always access the recording. And thank you so much for taking the time to answer those two, because I know you're keen to talk about diversity in the newsroom.
Yes.
So I see that you are currently able to practice in a country which trends quite positively when it comes to press freedom. And one of the ways that you can employ that freedom is by ensuring diverse voices are represented in your work, right? So I'm curious to understand why. Why is the process of how news is made important, right? And why are diverse voices important? Like maybe that's a good place to start to set some context.
Yes, and I just would like to add that because I work in such like a free country or in a such free context, we are able to like have these conversations where I would question my bosses, or I'm able to question the industry itself as well about diversity, for example. But why it's important that the voices are diverse? They reflect, well, news is supposed to reflect our society, right? And if we think about who are presented in the news and who make the news, well, what can be said is like in Finland, I think in many Western countries, and also I've read about it in Guardian, many newsrooms are very white. And so the perspectives on topics are as well very white. And if we are not able to broaden what we cover, the ways we cover, the perspectives, the angles that we look at things from, we lose the trust of the society. And I think that's a question of democracy as well, because when people are represented, when their topics are covered from very diverse angles, people get the information that they need in a democracy, I think. And Omar and Nakul, if you had questions at any point, please ask questions. Can I? Oh well, do you have a question, Angat, or can I talk a bit about the who are making the news and why is that problematic? And
absolutely, I think why don't we open it up as you suggested, and feel free to talk about that. And Nakul and Omar, I mean, you guys are lucky that you're in a smaller room, which means it gives you more time to speak and ask the questions that you might, or topics that might be of interest to you. So please feel free to pick Miya's brain as well. But if you, Nakul, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, so usually like I take part in MUNs, which is like Model United Nations. So in that, like recently, just like last week, we had a topic about in the HRC committee, we had a topic talking about freedom of expression with special emphasis on journalistic safety. So in that, a small topic came upon, like they talked about the Charlie Hebdo magazines. So in that, sometimes they like published some pictures or something which was like hurtful or which was offending the Islamic people. It was about Prophet Muhammad. So like, would you say that like they like post stuff, like they put stuff like that in their magazine due to like lack of people from different backgrounds, or like how would like people like stop like doing that or something?
Yeah, I think you're onto something here, because well, one of the examples that I wanted to say, for example, is that when the journalistic staff, when it's not very diverse, there's also the sense of like what is normal in the society, right? So if you're, and that changes from place to place, because you know what is normal or acceptable in, or what kind of humor is okay, is different from Finland to India to France. You know, it varies, and then when the makers are not diverse, there is no one to question, like, hey, like for example, this, especially discourse of Muslim folk, like how often are Muslims portrayed as terrorists, for example, or and way more easier than a white criminal who, I don't know, goes and shoots someone in the US. And I think this is related to the fact that religious minorities are also underrepresented, and also the lack of knowledge, lack of education. Well, just an example of well, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I guess we're just, I'm going somewhere. I had a situation in one of my one of my workplaces before this current workplace. And that was the first time Finland had a terrorist attack. And then they made this piece of news that was like a 2 pages, and it had a picture of refugees, or well, it wasn't refugees that they said they were refugees, but you can't know it. But it was time when there were a lot of people coming in 2015, a lot of like people seeking asylum in Europe, and you'd had a picture from train station in Finland with a lot of like Middle Eastern looking men with a text saying terrorists can just walk in, and how wrong is that when you don't, when you're showing people's faces, what kind of imagery do you create? How do you create fear? That's why words matter. That's why framing matters. Like, do we create fear? Do we create polarization between people? Or, well, and in this case, it was just like, out there. And I'm, and I guess there was no one to say like, hey, are you aware that not all people who look Muslim, whatever that means, are not, like, you cannot portray all of them as terrorists. I don't know, Nicole, if I answered you, but I just can kind of like added to the conversation.
Yeah, you did in the first half. It's okay. So like another quick question. So basically, I also like researched about France in general. So like they always say that like France like actually promotes freedom of press a lot. So again, like based on like when they saw what happened on the Charlie Hebdo case and all, they didn't put out any like a statement saying that we will restrict them from like making new magazines or something like that. So like, do you believe like magazines like this, or like any like say the New York Times or whatever, should they be allowed to an extent where they can like actually hurt people's sentiments or their like religious whatever beliefs and all?
That is a very, very good question. And I think it's a very difficult question as well, because then it comes to the freedom of press and freedom of speech but I personally, well, I think that is a very difficult question, because at the same time, we should not, like censorship is not something that, should be anywhere. And at the same time, those things, as you said, they were hurtful and disrespectful. And I mean, obviously, however hurtful they were, they never justify violence, obviously, like physical violence. I don't really have an answer to that question, because it's like, because in freedom of press is such a balance. And I think, like, I personally think that freedom of speech, as I said, with freedom of press comes also like responsibility. So it's not that you can just go and be hateful against a group of people, whatever it is, maybe ethnical minorities, religious minorities, maybe sexual, gender minorities, and so on. And I mean, from back home, I can also say that the legislation when it comes to hate speech is very it's not very clear what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. And then again, not talking so much about Charlie Hebdo, but just talking in general, like if you think about who will be in power, and when the power changes, whose thoughts, if you have legislation that is sort of adapted into a certain situation, and when the power dynamics change, how will that be applied to the new situation, in a sense that sort of restricting speech, freedom of speech, freedom of expression with legislation, that is very dangerous, because then it can turn against the good like attempts that people might have had doing them. But there definitely should be, well, ways of, I think there definitely should be respect toward, but that's just my personal view.
I think there's also the case of, like, I really resonate with this idea that, words hurt, and people, in many cases now, especially with some of the more independent journalism or journalism that's more internet-based, the opportunity for other users to just troll people who put out an opinion oftentimes authors of those opinions being, falling into severe depression or other forms of where they really just break down because they can't handle the kind of attacks that are coming their way. So it's, for me, although freedom of speech is something we should um, fall behind and support, I just feel that in today's information age, especially, there's more opportunity for hurt over how people phrase things or how they troll and attack you. But I also wanted to just take a pause to see if Omar had anything he wanted to say or any questions he had, because I know we have about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I have a question. So, what if like the endeavor to like stifle trust isn't direct? So, for example, we have a lot of like people saying that criticism of Saudi Arabia is Islamophobic, or criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. So, like when like these ways to like curb press aren't direct, how do you like deal with that?
Can you repeat what you meant, just so that I can get your
Yeah.
point? I think your point is important. I just want to like make sure that I understood it correctly.
So, like, what do you think about people trying to stop like press freedom and like criticism of certain countries or like entities by like claiming that they infringe on other people's rights or like they contribute to a certain group's oppression? Basically.
Yeah, that is once again a very good question and a very difficult question as well. But for example, you brought up Israel and you brought up Saudi Arabia, I think. And when, for example, I can just, well, what I know about Israel is that, anything, if you criticize Israel, you're just like, you're very easily labeled as like you said, anti-Semitic or against Israel, whereas many people definitely are not, might not be against Israel. It's against politics or a certain way of politics or occupation and so on. Well, I don't think that's correct. I think it should be, press should have the freedom to tell the truth, because if you don't have the freedom to tell the truth, we lose, like, we're not trustworthy, and people go to other sources that are even less not even less trustworthy, because I believe the news and most are trustworthy, but that are not, but they go to sources that are not trustworthy. But yeah, I don't know if I answered your question. I hope I did. And that is also a very difficult question. Yeah, and I think like
Sorry, go ahead. Please finish.
No, I just wanted to say that when what you also, Angat, said about the freedom of speech, like, I don't think it's freedom of speech to go and tell someone that, well, you're ugly and you're this and that, or that's bullying. So I think it's a different thing when we talk about freedom of speech, and we cannot really like mask bullying, for example, to freedom of speech. And I guess that could apply to some extent to like also larger like countries as well, or larger context, in a bit, like if you just adjust it to a bit differently.
So welcome to our breakout room, where we're going to be discussing the intersection between journalism and social media. So before we get into the theme, actually, there were a few questions that had come in from students on campus. And one of the questions, so we'll do the two of those, and then we'll move into what the theme of our breakout room is. So the first question was, what steps can journalists working in countries with high access to freedom of press take to increase access to freedom of press in countries where it is heavily restricted? So if you're working in a place which is highly evolved in that area, what can you do to pass it on?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that people can do. One being that if you're in a country like, for instance, let's say the US, which has its own freedom of the press problems, but for this example, I would say that what journalists can do here is report on the media climates in other countries where, like India, for example, where journalists are not able to do the work that they do. I think you have to build solidarity between different journalists. I think that there are inherent problems when it's like a Western country and a global South country. So I think that it's also a good idea to have journalists from all of these countries where the freedom of press is restricted band together and sort of create like that does happen. You have like organizations that advocate for the rights of the press and journalism. And I think that while that is happening, it's also a good idea for journalists who have the ability to report freely and criticize governments, criticize big corporates or whatever, the things that prevent journalists from countries like India to not report. People who should take up the baton, kind of, right? Like you report on, for me personally, like I report on mostly Indian politics from New York because I have that blanket of immunity to some degree that a lot of my colleagues in India don't, because people are getting slapped with sedition charges, like being put into jail for 3 months just for very rightfully criticizing government action. Whereas being here, it's not that much of a risk relatively. And so I think it's almost a responsibility that you do the things that other people can't do. But at the same time, keeping in mind that like you shouldn't be speaking for communities. Like for me, it's different because I'm from India. I work there mostly. But even then, just for foreign media to sort of like for everyone to band together and kind of adapt to an environment where you're not able to speak as freely as you should, and sort of work towards bringing that like for everybody equitably across the globe. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important tenets of the press is that they remain fair and independent. And my next question, which also kind of starts approaching our theme, is that how can the government of a country really affect the autonomy of the press and of media outlets? What is the sort of extent to which that can take place?
I think they should not, but they do, unfortunately, in a lot of places. It depends very much on the country, because I think like in an Indian context, it's very unofficial. It's not that, they have any legal clauses that say that we can restrict the press, but in practice, it's very different, right? Because you have governments who arrest people on these like very outdated laws that prevent journalists from being able to even, people are getting arrested for what they tweet, which is just a bizarre thing to conceptualize. But beyond that, it's also how a government, like how much bureaucracy you put in place. Is what I started to say earlier, is that if you just don't give permission to a journalist or a publication to report, they can't do it. Like you think that, in India, it's sort of like easy, you just get around it, you just do it anyway. And a lot of journalists do take that risk. But for example, I was working at BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed got sued by the Indian government 4 times for writing news stories. They literally made us remove our content. They imposed, I think it was like a 1 lakh fine on the company, which, for BuzzFeed, it's not terrible, but it could be for a small news publication. And just like a constant, we would be at in the Warsaw fishing village, and the cops would come and be like, no, get out of here. And that's very much a government-backed thing. But that being said, I think there's also a lot of corruption that happens in countries where there is freedom of the press. Like in the US, when I report here, there is also a government meddling in media outlets, right? Because they so many stories get shut because you have powerful friends who are able to call in favors with your reporters. The media is very corporate, and when media is corporate owned by really big conglomerates, that also has government ties. There's no, everything is super linked in a very hyper capitalist system. So very much so, I think governments affect media freedom.
So the master's project that you're currently working on, it's actually looking at how the Indian government has been using social media and the virtual space really to target journalists, to stifle any kind of criticism. And we of course we're seeing this play out on a very large scale with the coverage of the pandemic. But before we get into that, and we definitely will, I wanted to zoom out a little bit, and I wanted to really ask you, how is it that digital journalism has evolved with social media coming in, and what have been some of the pros and cons of this evolution?
Yeah, so I think a lot of things have happened, right? Like with the burst of social media and the internet culture. I think one of the big things is that traditional journalism, the way that like our parents probably think about it, like the newspaper, print journalism, I think people are right when they say it's kind of a dying field. It's not. I mean, people do still read newspapers, especially in certain parts of the world, but that's fading out, right? Just as any, like all of these old school things are sort of being phased out. And so as far as journalism goes, I think what's happening is that companies and like editors and reporters have to adapt to that social media environment, and more people are consuming news in like shorter form, visually appealing forms. I personally think it can be a really powerful thing to have news access people of all age groups, all kinds of disabilities, accessible populations. But yeah, like what the evolution really is that it becomes like you see companies like Now This or Vox having like 1-minute segments of like a pretty emotional narratives of people who are going through things in like completely the other side of the globe. So I think that's a big benefit, is that if someone in like some random rural part of the US can be tweeting resign Modi, that's unheard of before. That's a very much native to digital journalism, that you're able to like sort of close the gaps between so many different communities around the world. I think there are also cons. Obviously, you're reducing something that's quite complex and something that's really, really maybe requires a lot of work and a lot of reporting. And a lot of journalists do put in the work. And then the final product will be like a 30-second video. And I think the challenge, like especially me as working as BuzzFeed, that's all we did. Like we took a really complicated, I would have like 30 pages of research for something, and the final video would be 2 minutes, and it has to be engaging, it has to be funny, it has to like get audiences involved, it has to also do justice to the story, it has to also give information, it has to serve all these roles in a very short time. And I think that's a different kind of creative field almost, because you're not only a journalist, you're also figuring out how to package this, how to publish it, how to market this news, which is not typically what news is supposed to do. People are supposed to want to have to watch the news or read the news and be informed, but now you have to convince people that it's worth watching. And so the things that you create have to be fun. They have to be like, they have to draw you in, because publications depend on views and ad revenue and like all of this other stuff that comes with being a social media native company. So yes, there are pros and cons. I think that like, in theory, the pros can outweigh the cons if done correctly, but at the same time, is it good? Like also who subscribes to things like Vox or New York Times? The people who already generally agree with that sort of way of thinking, right? You're not gonna have a hard-hitting piece of journalism reach the people that it's supposed to change the minds of. Right? Like in India, for example, like if you're writing like a scathing piece, or like Arundhati Roy's piece in The Guardian, it's not being read by like the BJP politicians. If anything, they're doing what they can to like have it removed, but it's not serving the purpose that like the people who support the BJP aren't reading The Guardian being like, okay, now my mind has changed,
Right.
So it does create those echo chambers. So I don't know, it's balanced.
And
sorry, I just rambled.
No, that was perfect. So I actually do have one more question, which is really about how all of this has played out in the context of COVID in India. So we can do that question, or since we have quite a small, cozy room, we can actually even pass it over to the audience. And if anyone wants to unmute themselves, ask questions, send it in the chat. It's yours to determine. While people are thinking, maybe we can start talking about
we can.
What it's been
like. Yeah, and I mean, you know, you're in India, so you probably have more firsthand experience with this. But I think it's crazy how bad the press situation is in India during the pandemic, because like in the last couple of weeks alone, you have people who are like rightfully, you know, tweeting at the government's like failure to provide oxygen to, you know, manage this crisis. When they had time, they had warning. And instead of the government taking responsibility and being, you know, or not even, you know, taking responsibility is a stretch, but even acknowledging that there's a problem, that's also not happening. Instead, you have the government going into people's homes, journalists, activists, random people who are tweeting against the government, seizing their laptops, filing UAPA charges against them. And that's not at all what a democratic country should be doing. That's not at all what anyone should be doing. And so the way that this really plays out is that actually going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think like it helps to have who cannot be arrested, whose property cannot be seized, tweet about the Indian government, right? So you have people who can call out the government from overseas, because the people who are doing it in India get arrested for doing that, for just tweeting, for putting an Instagram post, which is really, really quite bizarre. And I think with COVID in general, like especially in UP, with like people are getting frustrated. Of course, people are posting on TikTok, they're posting on Instagram, they're posting on every social media they have available, and that in a way is also a good thing, because like 10, 15 years ago, I don't think you'd have any outlet to like make this so public, and then their tweets get picked up by people elsewhere, and then it becomes a social media movement. And I think this is with COVID, I think this is the first time that I personally find the social media activism to be like productive, because a lot of times people like criticize, being like, oh, you just, you know, shared a link and you think that's it. But yeah, but you know, I don't know, that's like this time I think like it actually is helping save people's lives by not just the government criticism, but by all. Yeah, I'm sorry, there are some questions.
Yeah,
like,
we
can
can
unmute and yeah.
You guys can just unmute yourselves and go ahead, or you can send it in the chat if you're more comfortable that way.
Yeah.
Kurt, do you want to start?
Sure. Hello, Paroma and Ninad and the rest of the breakout room. I have a question with regards to ethical journalism, in the sense that, have you ever found yourself not in the position to cover a particular story because of perhaps contextual, ethnic, or indigenous reasons, in the terms of appropriation as well? Do you find yourself in difficult positions where you don't think you deserve to tell a story? The
timing of that was too accurate.
Well, this is a great question, right? I think like that's a line that a lot of journalists like find themselves around, and for me personally too, like I try to report on communities and stories that I know well and that I don't feel like I'm exploiting. But I think like in general, the role of a journalist is to sort of listen, right? You're not going there with preconceived notions. You're not going into a space or into a community saying that I'm going to tell your story. No, you go there, you say, what are some problems that concern you? What would you like me to write about? And I think that's been my approach. I think most good journalists approach it that way. I do feel like, especially the story that I was talking about earlier, it took like a lot of time before I was like, you know, the people that you talk to, your sources, they have to trust you. You don't just go into a space and say like, I know everything about this place, I'm an expert, I'm going to write about it. So I think like with the Koli women, that they're an indigenous lower caste community, they live 5-10 minutes away from my house in Bombay, but like it's worlds apart, right? It's an entirely different space that I know for a fact that like I don't belong to. And there is that like aspect of like, you like, I don't even know if I would call it a savior complex, but it has that definite like there's a discrepancy there. And so I think like for me, going like you have to just build trust, right? You have to go there, you have to spend a lot of time getting to know people. I didn't interview anyone for like the first 2 months. I just went and like got to know everybody, like hung out, you know, saw what they were doing. They were like carried like kilos of fish with them back and forth for like 2 or 3 months until, and you know, in India, it's slightly different because Indian people are just so happy to like chat. Like there isn't so much of this like debate on, oh, what's, you know, like I'm trying to even phrase it correctly. Like there's not so much of like, there's not that many walls to break. I think Indian people are very forthcoming, very honest, and very happy to like sort of talk through whatever it is that bothers them. Yeah, and it was actually a surprisingly easy and good experience. I think when you're a freelance journalist, which is what I've done for most of my career outside of BuzzFeed doesn't even really count as journalism. I was in BuzzFeed News, but when you're a freelancer, the way that it works is that you pitch a story to somebody. So really, you take as much time as you need, and when you feel like, okay, there's a story here, then you pitch it, and then the sort of the timeline is on you, and then you just at the end of it, you like decide. You pitch it to people, publications, and then they're like, okay, this is worth picking up. That being said, you know, for many news organizations, yes, it's a fast news cycle. You want to have even the more in-depth stories are like people will expect that you turn it on deadline, and that can be stressful, right? And that's a very tough balance because like I did a story about a lower caste community in New York, and I didn't have that much time. I had 2 weeks to do the story. I was like, it feels so weird to go into like this family's home in Jackson Heights and be like, yeah, tell me about caste and stuff. Like they have no idea who I am. I'm going, and like it was a very awkward experience. But again, with Indian people, like they were like, yeah, let me tell you about, and they were like they were really happy to talk about it because no one has ever known to ask that question. Right, because you're here in New York where like people don't talk about caste at all, so you can hear the police sirens. It's constant. But yeah, I mean, and I think like for communities that I don't know much on, like I was writing about disability and people on wheelchairs accessing vaccination sites. I think for the most part, like when you're covering stories of marginalized groups or people who don't normally get mainstream spotlight, they are generally very happy to talk to you. The fact that you've even thought about reporting on a community is like a very personal problem. You just get to know people. Like really, I'll just go and be like, hey, what's up? Like, how's your experience been? Like, just tell me how you're feeling. And that's a great way to like just quickly get into, you know, a person's life. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Ashla, you've had your hand up for so long.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. I mean, Kurt's question was great, so I'm glad I could hear the answer to that. And also, I'm such a fan of BuzzFeed. I'm so happy you're here. But so my question was that, like, as consumers of like constant consumers of media, and especially as like students and young adults who are so connected to social media and who at least try to be socially aware, what are our responsibilities? Like what should we keep in mind when we are consuming media, especially so constantly right now?
Yeah, it's a perfect question, right? I think like for me, because yes, I'm a journalist, but I also read the news all the time. And so for me personally, I think like it's super, there's two things. One is knowing what news sources you're reading and understanding where they come from and understanding the context of which the reporters are operating within. So like what Kurt said, like, is this a news organization that turns out 10 stories a day? So how much weight and how much importance do you think that the company is giving to the stories they're telling? That can be found by like some, you know, quick research. And I think like these big name publications like New York Times, The Guardian, et cetera, like BBC, they've developed a reputation for a reason. Like, you know that their editors are good. You know that they have like strong ethical things. At the same time, I think you always should be critical. I think New York Times' international reporting is frankly can be garbage. You know, the way that they cover the global south and they cover anything that's not American, it's because their newsrooms are 99% Americans who've never left the country, writing about like Kenyan elections or writing about like Indian travel or whatever, but they've never even been there. And so like just sort of noting that byline, feel free to look up the journalist who writes a thing, you know, and kind of make your judgment call. Another siren. But that's one thing. But when you're like browsing through, sorry, it's literally stopped right outside my window. Can you still hear me when I talk? Okay. Yeah, so I think, I think that like when you're browsing through social media as well in the morning, or whatever time of the day, when you're like scrolling through social media, knowing that, you know, like when you read a piece of news, I like my first instinct when something seems like, oh, that seems not possible, or like this seems kind of so out there that like, is it even true? Just looking it up on like other publications, like, you know, it's like for breaking news, for headlines and stuff, it's fine. But if you're like doing something more in depth, I would do a cross-examination, like basic, like it would take 5-10 minutes at most, and be like, okay, multiple people are picking this up, look at their sources. Are they all coming from the same source? Like, I think in India, what happens is one publication will write a story and then everyone else will write the same story and quote each other. And so then you get like caught in this loop. Generally speaking, it's not wrong, because I think like most organizations do have processes in place to have like ethical and like verified information. The other thing I was just going to say really quickly is also balance your own like mental health and well-being. Don't get overwhelmed by the amount of media that, you know, you see. And so just sort of be selective about what you're consuming before you like collapse. But yeah, sorry, I talked so much.
No, that was amazing. Thank you so much.
That's why we called you, so it's fine.
Yeah, no, I when you invited me, I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna talk for like 3 hours. It's never gonna end.